Caught my wife cheating, so I destroyed her lover's marriage. My wife, 31 female, and I, 34 male, have been married for 8 years. We met when I was fresh out of college and working my first real job, and she was waitressing at a local diner. I still remember the way her smile lit up the room and how easy it was to talk to her. She was the love of my life, or at least, I thought she was. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but I believed we were solid. We had our disagreements, sure, but who doesn't? I thought we'd weather the storms that came with being together for so long. I never imagined that one day, I'd be writing this story, sharing the most painful betrayal of my life. Everything started to unravel about 6 months ago. It was subtle at first, changes I probably would have ignored if they hadn't started piling up. My wife began dressing differently, wearing clothes she hadn't touched in years. She started going to the gym more often, saying she wanted to feel healthier. At first, I was supportive. I even encouraged her, telling her how proud I was of her for taking care of herself. But then, there were the late nights. She started coming home later than usual, claiming she was working overtime or out with friends. That wasn't like her. She'd always been someone who enjoyed being home, cuddled up on the couch with me, watching our favorite shows. Now, she was distant. The first real red flag was when I noticed she'd changed her phone password. We'd always been open with each other about things like that, not because we didn't trust each other, but because we had nothing to hide. I asked her about it, and she brushed me off, saying she'd updated it for security reasons. I wanted to believe her. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I was being paranoid. But something deep down wouldn't let me shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, a few weeks ago, I found the first undeniable piece of evidence. She'd left her phone on the kitchen counter while she was taking a shower. A notification popped up, a text from someone named Derek. I didn't recognize the name, and the preview said, "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing." My stomach dropped. I couldn't breathe for a moment, frozen in place as my mind raced. Who the hell was Derek? Why was he sending her a message like that? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't ignore it either. I decided to open the message. I know it was a breach of privacy, but in that moment, I felt like I had no choice. What I found shattered me. There were dozens of messages between my wife and Derek, going back weeks, maybe months. They were explicit, filled with things I wish I could unsee. I scrolled through in disbelief, my heart pounding. She'd been needing him, sneaking around behind my back. When she came out of the shower, I tried to play it cool, but I couldn't hide how upset I was. She asked if I was okay, and I lied, telling her I was just tired. That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed everything I'd seen on her phone. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I knew I couldn't confront her without proof. I started paying closer attention to her behavior, noting when she left the house and where she said she was going. I even checked our shared credit card statements, looking for anything unusual. Sure enough, there were charges I couldn't explain, dinners at fancy restaurants, hotel bookings in the middle of the day. It wasn't until last Friday that I finally got the confirmation I needed. She told me she was meeting a friend for lunch, but something about the way she said it felt off. I decided to follow her. I know it sounds crazy, but I couldn't take the lies anymore. I parked my car a block away from the restaurant she said she'd be at and waited. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, I saw her walk in, with Derek. Watching them together was like a punch to the gut. They were laughing, holding hands, completely oblivious to the world around them. My wife, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, was sitting across from another man, acting like I didn't exist. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the shock, or maybe it was the realization that this was bigger than just me and her. I needed to think about what I was going to do next. I spent the weekend going over everything in my head, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. On Sunday night, I finally confronted her. I told her I knew about Derek, that I'd seen the messages, followed her to the restaurant. At first, she denied it, but when I showed her the evidence, she broke down. She admitted everything, how she'd met Derek at the gym, how it started as harmless flirting and escalated into something more. She begged for forgiveness, swore she'd end things with him, promised she'd do whatever it took to fix our marriage. But the damage was done. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen, couldn't undo the betrayal. I spent the next few days in a haze, trying to figure out what to do. That's when I had an idea. If Derek was married, his wife deserved to know. I did some digging online and found her social media profiles. Her name was Megan, and from what I could tell, she had no idea what her husband was up to. They had 2 kids together, a boy and a girl. Seeing their family photos made me sick to my stomach. I debated whether to reach out to her. Part of me felt like it wasn't my place, but another part of me couldn't stand the thought of her living a lie, just like I had been. In the end, I decided she deserved to know the truth. I sent her a message, explaining everything I knew. I attached screenshots of the texts between my wife and Derek, proof that couldn't be ignored. I wasn't sure how she'd react, but I felt like I'd done the right thing. When Megan responded, she was understandably devastated. She thanked me for telling her, said she'd had her suspicions but never had any proof. She told me she was going to confront Derek and figure out what to do next. As for me, I don't know where to go from here. My wife says she wants to make things work, but I don't know if I can ever trust her again. Part of me wants to believe her, to try to save what we had, but another part of me feels like it's already too late. After I messaged Megan, I felt a strange sense of relief, like some of the weight had been lifted off my chest. But that feeling didn't last long. The reality of everything hit me like a freight train when Megan called me later that evening. Her voice was trembling, a mix of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. She wanted to know everything, how long this had been going on, how I found out, and if I had any more proof. I answered her questions as honestly as I could, even though reliving it made my stomach churn. Megan broke down in the middle of the call, sobbing as she told me about her life with Derek. They'd been married for 10 years. She told me about their kids, how she'd thought Derek was a good husband and father, even though he'd been acting distant lately. Hearing her pain made everything feel even more real. This wasn't just my marriage falling apart, this was someone else's entire family. When I hung up the phone, I sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall. I couldn't stop thinking about Megan's kids, how they'd be affected by this. It made me question whether I'd done the right thing by telling her. But deep down, I knew she deserved to know. Meanwhile, my wife and I weren't speaking much. After I confronted her, she tried everything to win me back, cooking my favorite meals, leaving me little notes apologizing, even offering to go to therapy. But I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. Every time I looked at her, I saw Derek. I saw the texts, the hotel receipts, the way she smiled at him in that restaurant. She swore she'd ended things with him, but I couldn't bring myself to believe her. And honestly, I wasn't sure if I even cared. The love I'd once felt for her had been replaced by anger and resentment. Things came to a head a few days later when Megan called me again. She told me she'd confronted Derek and he'd admitted everything. She said he tried to downplay it, claiming it wasn't serious, that it was just a fling and it didn't mean anything. But Megan wasn't having it. She kicked him out of the house and told him she was filing for divorce. Her decision made me start questioning my own. If she could walk away after 10 years of marriage and 2 kids, why was I still here, clinging to something that was clearly broken? That night, my wife and I had our most intense fight yet. She begged me to forgive her, to let her prove that she could be a better wife, but I'd reached my breaking point. I told her I needed space, that I couldn't even think about saving our marriage until I figured out what I wanted. I packed a bag and left. I stayed with my brother for a few days. He didn't ask too many questions, which I appreciated, but when I finally opened up to him, he was furious on my behalf. He told me I deserved better, that I shouldn't waste my time trying to fix something that was so clearly broken. But walking away wasn't as easy as it sounded. 8 years of my life were tied to this woman. We'd built a life together, shared memories, dreams, and plans for the future. Letting all of that go felt like ripping out a piece of myself. I spent hours going over everything in my head, trying to make sense of what had happened. How did we get here? Was there something I could have done differently? Was this my fault? Those questions haunted me, keeping me up at night. I decided to take Megan up on her offer to meet in person. She said she wanted to compare notes, to make sure we both had the full picture of what our spouses had done. We met at a coffee shop, and it was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. She was kind, even in her pain. She told me about the little things Derek used to do that didn't seem suspicious at the time but made sense now. How he'd started taking his phone everywhere with him, even to the bathroom, how he'd suddenly gotten into fitness after years of being a couch potato. Hearing her story felt like looking in a mirror. The parallels between our experiences were uncanny. It was clear that Derek and my wife had been deeply involved, sneaking around for months, maybe longer. Megan told me she didn't regret kicking Derek out, even though it was hard on her and the kids. She said she couldn't live with someone who had so blatantly disrespected her and their family. Her strength inspired me. After our meeting, I made my decision. I told my wife I wanted a divorce. When I told her, she didn't cry this time. She just looked at me with this hollow expression, like she'd known this was coming but hoped it wouldn't. She asked if there was anything she could do to change my mind, and when I said no, she nodded and walked away. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, awkward conversations, and difficult decisions. We had to figure out how to divide our assets, who would keep the house, and what our lives would look like moving forward. It was messy and painful, but I knew it was the right thing to do. Megan and I stayed in touch throughout the process. We weren't friends exactly, but there was a sense of solidarity between us. We'd both been betrayed by the people we trusted most, and that created a bond I couldn't explain. One night, about a month after I'd moved out, Megan called me out of the blue. She told me Derek had been trying to win her back, sending her flowers, writing her long letters, even showing up at her work. She asked me if my wife had been doing the same. I told her the truth. My wife had stopped trying. It was like she'd given up, like she knew there was no coming back from what she'd done. Megan said she was glad she'd stood her ground, but I could hear the sadness in her voice. She wasn't happy about how things had turned out, but she knew it was the only way forward. As for me, I was starting to feel the same way. Letting go of my marriage was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it was also the most liberating. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. It's been a few months now, and while I'm still picking up the pieces, I know I made the right choice. Some days are harder than others, but I'm learning to focus on myself, to rebuild my life on my own terms. And as for my wife and Derek, I don't know, and honestly, I don't care. Update: it's been about 6 months since everything happened, and my life looks completely different now. At first, the aftermath was a mess, emotionally, legally, and financially. But slowly, I've started to regain some sense of normalcy. Looking back, I realized just how much my wife's betrayal had consumed me, and walking away was the best decision I could have made. After I moved out, I focused on myself for the first time in years. I started going to therapy, and it's been life-changing. At first, I was skeptical. I thought, how is talking to someone about my problems going to fix anything? But it did. My therapist helped me unpack not just the betrayal, but also the deeper issues in my marriage that I'd been ignoring for years. One of the hardest truths I've had to face is that the cracks in our relationship started long before the affair. My wife's cheating was the breaking point, but there were problems we both contributed to: poor communication, taking each other for granted, and avoiding tough conversations. Don't get me wrong, I'm not excusing her actions. What she did was unforgivable. But therapy has helped me understand that healing is about more than just blaming someone else. As for Megan, she and I stayed in touch for a while, but our conversations became less frequent over time. I think we both realized that clinging to each other, even as a support system, wasn't healthy. The last I heard, she finalized her divorce from Derek and moved in with her parents for the time being to focus on her kids. I admire her strength so much. She told me once that her children were her biggest motivation to keep going, and I hope she finds the happiness she deserves. And Derek, well, apparently, he tried to win Megan back a few more times, but she didn't budge. He's still in contact with their kids, but Megan has set strict boundaries. I don't know much else about him, and honestly, I don't care. As for my ex-wife, things got even messier after our divorce was finalized. She tried to reconnect with me a few weeks later, saying she wanted to clear the air. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her for coffee. She started off apologizing again. She admitted that she'd been selfish and had taken me for granted, but she also said something that caught me off guard. She claimed the affair wasn't just about Derek. She said she'd felt unseen and unimportant in our marriage for years. Hearing that was a gut punch. I thought I'd been a good husband. I worked hard to provide for us, supported her when she wanted to switch careers, and always made time for us to be together. But hearing her perspective made me realize that maybe we'd both been living in different versions of our marriage. That doesn't excuse her actions, though. When I pointed that out, she just nodded and said, "I know. I messed up, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." She told me she hadn't spoken to Derek in months and that she'd started seeing a therapist herself. She asked if there was any chance we could try again someday. I told her no. I told her that while I didn't hate her anymore, I could never trust her again. That conversation was the closure I didn't know I needed. I walked away from it feeling lighter, like a chapter of my life had finally come to an end. Now, I'm focusing on building a new life for myself. I moved to a new apartment in a different part of the city, started working out more, and even took up a hobby I'd always wanted to try: photography. It's been a great way to keep my mind busy and rediscover parts of myself I'd lost over the years. I've also started dating again, which has been interesting, to say the least. I'm not rushing into anything serious, but it feels good to meet new people and remember what it's like to connect with someone. I'm taking it slow, though I know I'm not fully healed yet, and I don't want to bring any baggage into a new relationship. Sometimes, I still think about what happened. There are moments when the memories sneak up on me. Something will remind me of her, or I'll see a couple holding hands and feel a pang of sadness. But those moments are becoming fewer and farther between. One thing I've learned through all of this is that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. I don't think I'll ever forget what she did, but I'm learning to forgive, not for her, but for me. Holding on to anger only hurts me, and I refuse to let this define the rest of my life. I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago, and I think that's a good thing. I've grown, learned, and become stronger because of what I went through. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I'm hopeful. And that's enough for now.